Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China. A few weeks ago, when I was traveling with my bike and a friend across China, a follower on YouTube asked me to make a video, and I promised him that when I was back and I had time, I would do so. Paul Lau 3835 asked, could you please do a video on China is never a threat to Australia, so AUKUS, or increasing defence spending for Australia, is just stupid and a waste of money. I think many people are interested, he said. I'd have to say many people in Australia are interested in this, but this is global, it's much bigger, and Paul is right, it's a waste of time and money for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the fact that it's extremely unlikely that Australia is ever going to get these submarines. But there's a lot more to the story than that, and I'll come to why there's more in just a moment. First of all, for people who don't really understand AUKUS, here's a short explanation. If you don't know what AUKUS is, please don't be too hard on yourself. There are 25 million people living in Australia. Several hundred of them work in Parliament. A few hundred are actually lawmakers. The Department of Defence probably has thousands of employees from the minister downwards. And I've yet to meet one who knows or can explain what AUKUS is and why it's important to Australians. A few years ago, Australia signed a deal with a French submarine manufacturer, Naval, to build some conventional submarines to replace the existing Collins-class subs, which are old, in desperate need of refurbishment or retirement. Naval, the company which won the contract, set about manufacturing and was doing an okay job. As with all complex projects, there were some contractual niggles, but the subs were being built, and they were scheduled for delivery a few years down the track. Until Boris Johnson came up with a better idea, or he thought so. Scott Morrison and him, the then Prime Minister, and Joe Biden entered an agreement whereby Australia would cancel the perfectly good submarines that were partially completed. They'd enter a new arrangement with the US to provide new nuclear-powered submarines, attack submarines, which the US would control and the Brits would put their latest and greatest technology into, and the shipyards in America would get much of this work, and it was a win-win for America, Britain, the military-industrial complex, and a complete loss for the taxpayers of Australia, who, A, can't afford them, B, don't need them, C, have been told by the Senate that the US needs all its subs and won't deliver them anyway, and D, are still paying for them despite that, and despite Trump first of all not knowing what AUKUS is, then deciding that America first means Australia won't get them, and then undeciding that, with Keir Starmer of the UK, that the deal might go ahead after all. Eventually, the plan is that Australia will buy submarines, but no one is actually sure how many. And in the very long term, they might build their own submarines, but no one knows for sure when or if that will happen. In the meantime, Australian taxpayers are sending money to the US, while the US are saying they're reviewing the deal. And Trump admitted quite clearly that he didn't even know what AUKUS was. These are not defensive tools, these submarines. They're attack subs, the first stage of which was recently announced in Australia, and the rotation of 1,200 personnel and the placement of 4 nuclear attack submarines in the port just outside the city of Perth in Western Australia. Now, Australians who are living in their own housing crisis right now have just found out that the Department of Defence is building homes for these staff, while the government is kicking the housing crisis down the road. Australia, with a labour and migration problem at the moment, will find 1,200 people who have spouses and partners that will be allowed to work based on their partner's visa status. Australia has a non-nuclear policy and will house 4 nuclear submarines without the capacity to know if they are carrying nuclear weapons into Perth. It seems that everything that could go wrong probably will go wrong. So now we understand maybe a little bit of the background. There's a very funny sketch on TV, on YouTube, made by Utopia. I've linked it, showing a group of military commanders attempting to justify this. The sketch encapsulated the reality. They're protecting their trade routes from their largest trading partner. It's actually very funny, or it would be, if it wasn't quite so serious. Now, getting back to the question, it's very easy for me to suggest that China isn't a threat, but it's difficult for me to prove it isn't. I've often argued that the use of language is very important, and the threats we read about are language rich. Let me say this with as much clarity as I can. There has never been in modern history a single threat issued by China to attack, invade, invoke restrictions or sanctions, nor to interfere in any sovereign country. I'll rephrase that so everyone can understand it. China has never made any threat to any country. It has never threatened to nor actually invaded another. It has never sanctioned a single country without first being sanctioned. It has not, in most of our lifetimes, taken up arms against another country, but it has built the greatest defensive force the world has ever seen. And that defensive force has never, not once in its history, invaded and occupied another country. It has not had a single military operation to defend China's national interests. It has never sought to protect China's trade routes anywhere in the world except in the Horn of Africa, where it works with 20 other countries, including the USA, to counter piracy in that region. In other words, if you think China is a threat, you have no basis to think this. And therefore, until you do, you are wrong to assume that they are any risk to you. Admittedly, a dog that has never bitten anyone can always start, but a dog is not a 5,000-year-old civilization that we can check the history of. It's reformed itself, not the dog, the country, from subjugation, humiliation, torture, murder, as was carried out not just by the Japanese, but also by the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Russia. Think not of the invasion, occupation, and mass murders by the Japanese in World War II, but 100 years prior to that, there was an 8-nation alliance, there was colonialism, there were concessions and treaty ports in which Chinese people were excluded, or if allowed, were subjected not to Chinese law, but to the law of the nation that controlled that mini-colony inside of China's borders. Let's consider then why it is that some people think China is a threat. In short, the US wants you to. The US is a capitalist country. The leaders of those capitalist countries refuse to accept that communism or socialism in any of its forms can possibly work. Workers around the UK after the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War were aware of this. Workers in the US around the Great Depression were aware of this. What did they fight for? In Europe, since feudalism ended, people would have been aware of this, as they and all the military and colonial subjects have been exploited by capitalism are aware of this. This is a global phenomenon. The rich get richer, the poor either fight wars or slave in horrible conditions to keep the rich that way. The poor are fed lines of patriotism, carry flags to their deaths, while the rich stay home and carry profits to their bank accounts. So when a country like China improves the lives of the vast majority of people inside of its borders, instead of exploiting them, it gives them education, healthcare. It ensures there's affordable food and accommodation. The people directing the stories that we're told will double down on tales of horror now that China is moving outside of its borders and improving the lives of billions of others. We're seeing interference on an industrial scale. We're seeing new narratives of fear and oppression, authoritarian regimes threatening the livelihoods of ordinary people. But the reality is, it's not working anymore. Ordinary people are starting to see through it, and mostly because of social media, not mainstream media. Hence, we're now seeing the control of social media, and that's exactly what's happening, keeping the narrative alive. The next time you read someone telling you China's a threat, look carefully at the words. China could use the Guadalajara port for military purposes. It never has. It's never expressed a wish to, but it could, and that's the threat. Guam, Darwin, Okinawa, and 100 other places around Asia are being used by the US military. What China could do, the US are doing. China could hit Washington with a nuclear warhead, but it never has. It's never suggested it might. It's even gone one step further as to say it's the only nuclear power in the world with an unconditional no first strike policy, while the USA is the only country in the world that has absolutely no compunction about striking first without warning, because they already have twice. What China could do, the US have done. China has never entered a mutual defense treaty with any other country in the world. The US has many. Another example that China can do something if it chooses to, but chooses not to, while the US already has. So when Paul asked me why China is not a threat, the reason is clear. They use diplomacy, negotiation, peacekeepers under UN guidance, and trade to deal with other countries. They've been doing it since before Jiang Tian. He went to Xinjiang before Jesus Christ was born. They did it when Zheng He went around the world nearly 600 years ago, before the Renaissance. They continue to do so today, leading by example. It isn't really hard to justify, but the only way to prove that China is a force for good is to bide our time and wait to see what they do. And remember to read well, read wisely, because every single article we read about China's military expansion, trade efforts, infrastructural support, peacekeeping activities, and even their negotiations to bring hostile partners to the table for discussions, all point to the same thing. China is a force for good, being portrayed by clever use of words as potentially leading to something the US or its imperial predecessors have already done. One final word, it isn't just me that thinks this. MIT, a highly respected United States institution, has produced a report called What Does China Want? And by reading thousands of documents, press releases, diplomatic cables, discussions with many Chinese officials and academics, they've come to the same conclusion. China is not an expansionist force. It has no ambitions beyond its own borders, and it concerns itself militarily only with the regions that the entire world already recognizes as China. If you're going to argue with this about me, you're going to need to refute the Massachusetts Institute of Technology first. That's all there is to it. Thanks once again for watching my take on China, and I will see you next time. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe, and make comments if you wish. I do read them all, and I will get back to most of them. See you next time.